welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is validating inputs using Bot Framework Composer and Power Virtual Agents. Let's go. So let's talk a little bit about why this episode is important. So Bot Framework Composer is an existing tool. It comes out of the Azure team. It is open source. And it is a way to reduce the amount of coding that is needed to build a bot. So if you look at this from a spectrum of low code to full code, with low code we've got Power Virtual Agents being that democratized tool that pretty much anyone can use to build a bot. Then on the far right we have the bot framework, right, where you do need to write code. It is a framework where there's a lot of things that are included for free per se, but it still requires more developer knowledge to go ahead and to use. Bot Framework Composer is somewhere in the middle. And it's this idea that you can use a graphical user interface to go ahead and build dialogues and triggers in order to reduce some of the technical complexity in building a bot. And I would put it somewhere in the middle of that spectrum from no code to pro code, but it is something that is useful. And one of the key capabilities is that there has been integration released at Ignite in preview this past fall, where we can go ahead and call Bot Framework Composer from PVA. Now, what is this? Why would we want to do this? What does this unlock? So certainly Bot Framework Composer does provide some good features, and that's really what we're going to leverage today. We're going to talk about one of them, but there are many. In addition to being able to perform some validation, data validation for inputs, there are other capabilities like adaptive cards. There also is something called language generation, which is pretty cool, which I'll show you here today. And all in all, it is a tool in our toolbox that we can leverage in order to go ahead and to build out even better experience. Before we dive deeper into the content, I wanted to let you know about an emerging community found at serverlessnotes.com. This is a community resource that covers best practices, tips, and latest announcements built on contributions by technology enthusiasts from around the globe. On serverlessnotes.com, you'll find content related to Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Bus, Azure Functions, and much, much more. Serverlessnotes.com is brought to you by Serverless 360, a portal that is focused on operations and support for Microsoft Azure serverless resources. Now, this is a complementary tool to the Azure portal, and it helps organizations in supporting Azure serverless applications. You can find out more about Serverless 360 at serverless360.com. Okay, so let's get into more details here. One thing to note is that there are some prerequisites. Bot Framework Composer is essentially a thick client application that we need to go ahead and install in order for this integration to take place. Now, as a starting point, when you're in the PVA portal and you're on the topics screen, where you would typically add a new topic or leverage the suggest topics feature, we will now see this button here called Open in Bot Framework Preview. Now, if you don't see it, it's probably going to hit your environment soon. I am using an environment in the US, and as a result, I do see this button. When I go ahead and click on this button, I will get prompted to go ahead and download Composer. I can go ahead and download it, and once it's downloaded, I'm going to get prompted to log in. You're going to want to log in with the same account that you are using with PVA. Essentially, we're going to create this sync between the two tools, and hence you need to make sure that you've got the same user logged in so that sync can go ahead and take place. So let's talk just a little bit about a demo and the use case itself. So what we've got here is we've got our end user who's going to use a chatbot, and they want to be able to go ahead and basically see what is the weather. Now, as part of the weather, you need to be able to provide your location. In this case, it would be through your zip code. And as a result, we don't want to pass a bad zip code or something that we just truly know isn't valid down to this API. It's just going to result in a failure, and that's not going to be good for anyone. So what we can go ahead and do is do this validation up front and be able to validate that the input is correct before we go ahead and send that information down to the Weather API. So for example, if we indicate what is the weather in Kirkland, Washington, that's going to fail because it's going to fail the zip code validation process that we do have. In addition, if we provided the zip code with the additional 3 numbers on top of it, that's also going to fail. What we're looking for is a 5-digit zip code, and as a result, we're going to see that this is correct. Now, in terms of why would you use this over, say, a Power Automate flow? And this is where I think the feature truly shines, and we're going to see it more so in the demo. But I would say one of the challenges or the limitation with Power Automate is that when you go ahead and call Power Automate, it can go do this validation for you. It can validate that it's a 5-digit zip code. It can connect to Weather API. There's no problems there. The problem becomes, what do you do when you have a situation where you have an invalid zip code? Currently with the way that PVA is constructed, it will go ahead and assign a variable to the response coming back from Power Automate. So if you need to reprompt, you start to have to build a lot of additional logic, and it isn't overly repeatable. This is one of the benefits of the Bot Framework Composer, and I just realized I spelled composer wrong. That's my bad. What you do is you go ahead and it will auto reprompt you. And what's going to happen is we're going to stay within the context of Bot Framework Composer until we get the validation done. And so this is a big feature. I'm a big fan of this feature. I really hope that we can do something with PVA and Power Automate to provide some similar capabilities, because naturally I do find that Power Automate is just very simple to use. So this is one of the key benefits here. And what we do is we have some additional control over top of how many times we're going to allow this to fail, and we can even provide some default capabilities. So the Bot Framework team's done a nice job with this feature, and that was really one of the reasons why I wanted to show this to you today, because I think there's a lot of value. So let's go ahead, let's dive right into it. Okay, so something I do want to call out before we get too into the details is that I have leveraged the Bot Framework Composer tutorials to help build out this use case. They do have a Weather API scenario that I did leverage to go ahead and help me build out this demo. I'll include the link here in the description if you want to check it out. One thing to note though, that this is going to use Bot Framework Composer and the Bot Framework emulator. So it's a little bit different than how we're going to approach this in PVA, but do note that there's going to be naturally a lot of shared learnings and shared information here that can be leveraged. There's going to be some subtle differences. The other thing I wanted to call out is that in our example, we're going to use this Open Weather API, and you're going to need to sign up for a free API key. So you don't need to give a credit card, nothing like that. It's pretty simple to go ahead and sign up. But there is going to be a point when we are in the API or the HTTP call from Bot Framework Composer where we need to include a key. This is where you're going to get it from. I will also include this in the description itself. And what we're going to find is when we go ahead and call this API, this is the message payload that is returned. I'll refer to this a little bit later when we get into running the demo itself. So I'm now in Power Virtual Agents. I'm in the Maker portal. As mentioned before, I can go ahead and click on Open in Bot Framework Preview. This is going to launch the Bot Framework Composer. Here is the Bot Framework Composer itself. I'm not going to go through and give you a whole tour. I would refer to some of the existing Bot Framework Composer tutorials. They're going to go through it in much more details than what I will. Something to note though is when you do go ahead and you launch this for the first time, it is going to prompt you to create a new project. And that becomes important because what we're going to have is some synchronization between PVA and Bot Framework Composer, which is really important. What's really great about this integration is that PVA is going to suck all of this config up and ingest it into the PVA runtime. We do not need a separate runtime in order to run this bot inside of PVA, which is great for you as a bot builder because that's less things for you to worry about from a plumbing and infrastructure perspective. The other thing you're going to notice, and this is one of the reasons why I caution some of the differences between when you're using PVA or just Bot Framework Composer on its own, you can see that in the upper right hand corner, our ability to use the emulator is disabled. So that's another thing just to be aware of. You can actually go and use Bot Framework Composer on its own. It has integration with the emulator in order for you to go ahead and test your composer logic. We're going to use PVA in order to go ahead and to do that. So once you create your project, which I've just called feature bot because that's the name of my PVA bot, what we're going to end up doing is going ahead and creating a dialog, and we also are going to create a trigger as a result, and that's what we've got going on here. This would be a dialog. Naturally, we can go ahead and add triggers to this specific dialog, and you can route requests from your trigger into a dialog. For my perspective, this first time, I'm just going to keep everything in the trigger. Something just to be aware of, it does help with some of your modularity, but in this case, it doesn't really, for this demo, doesn't really add a whole lot of value, but probably just adding more confusion. So what we're going to do here on the inside of my trigger, what's going to happen is I'm going to provide trigger phrases. When I go ahead and save this specific trigger, it's going to add those trigger phrases back up in PVA. And so we're going to see that when we go ahead and publish this bot. I will make sure to show you that, but this is where you can go ahead and add your trigger phrases. Now, as part of Bot Framework Composer, we have the equivalent of send a message, which is called send a response here. So here we can go ahead and provide a series of responses back to the user. Now, in this case, we're just going to welcome them to the weather bot. We're going to then go ahead and ask them a question. So this is the equivalent of ask a question. It's going to be prompt for text. How you go ahead and add these to your canvas is, this is the send a response action. Here we can go ahead and ask a question and basically set the data type that we're expecting back from that specific question itself. Now, this is kind of a cool feature. I might do another video just on this itself, but it is kind of cool. We do see this a fair bit with PVA customers where they want to be able to add some personality to their bot. They don't want it to feel overly robotic. And so what this allows us to do is we can use what they call language generation and provide a series of different statements that will get chosen at random when we go run our bot. So it's not going to feel like it's always the same. We can introduce some subtle changes as a result of that. Now, this is where things get interesting. This is part of the core part of the demo here. So when we ask a question, we have the ability to manipulate the user input and how that will be managed. So what we've got here is a property, which is the equivalent of a variable. We're going to call it user.zipcode. User gives some scope, meaning this is applied to the user. So across multiple sessions, this and requests, this is going to be stored in that context. What we're also going to do just to improve the reliability and the accuracy of our output is we're going to go ahead and trim it. Make sure people haven't entered a space before or after they've entered their data. And we're going to just provide a little bit of validation there, which is great. Now, the other thing that we can do is if we click on other, this is pretty cool as well. We can start to go ahead and add additional validation here. So here we've got unrecognized prompt. So the message that we want to send when the max turn count, if specified, has been exceeded and the default value is selected as the value, right? So that's useful. This is golden right here, our validation. Here we can go ahead and write an expression. And in this case, we'll write the expression that says, I want to make sure that the length of the input value is equal to 5. If I put 6, if I put 3, if I put 4, it's going to basically say that's invalid. And this is the prompt that we're going to give back to the user. Sorry, the value you provided is invalid. We're looking for a 5-digit zip code that looks like this. Perfect. And so what's going to happen is if people continue to provide bad values, we are going to display this prompt. Now, in order to avoid kind of that endless loop, we can indicate the max turn count. So how many attempts do we want to give the user before we say, okay, enough's enough, and let's get moving. And so what we can do, and this obviously is going to depend on your scenario. Sometimes this will make sense, sometimes this won't. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to provide a default value of Kirkland, and we will just return the weather for Kirkland just to get people moving. And so what essentially we have here is when we prompt for text, we're going to have essentially our variable that we've talked about here. And what this really represents here is like a loop, where we're going to continue to loop. and wait for valid input to be provided before we continue. And this is the secret sauce here, right? This is what doesn't exist in PVA, and I really hope this makes it into PVA because that would be golden. The next thing we're going to do is we want to contact an external system, right? So we can access external data sources by sending an HTTP request, and that's what we're going to do here. Here we've got our URL for our weather bot, and as part of this, we also do have the secret key that we need to go ahead and provide. Now, as part of this request, I'll include this request right in the description as well, but we're going to pass in our variable here, right? The user.zip code that we talked about before is what gets passed as a query parameter, and that is going to be pulled from this variable that we've stored our input in. In addition, we've got the API token that I've spoken about before. You do need to sign up for that in that open weather service itself. Now, this is where I feel like Power Automate is a little bit more user-friendly, where we can go ahead and, we have the return values that come from essentially an API call, and we don't have to, worry, or maybe it's just more of a different experience, but when we call our service and the response, it's going to get stored in a variable or a property that we declare, and this is going to have dialog scope, and we're just going to call it API_response. We need to provide some additional information, the content type, in this case, it'll be application JSON, and then also the response type, which will be JSON in this case. Now, in terms of this payload, what does this look like? And this is where perhaps some of my frustration comes in with Power Automate. I feel like I've got better visibility into this. But if I go ahead and look at the response from the API call, what I can go ahead and see is what this looks like, right? So this is JSON. I've got these different attributes like the city, the rain, what is the low temperature, the high temperature, the current temperature, the overall state of rain, etc. We also have an icon that we could use in an adaptive card if we ever wanted to go down that path. But this is essentially the message shape that's going to be returned. And then inside of Bot Framework Composer, we need to be able to interpret that when we use the data down here a little bit later. Now, we want to make sure we've got a successful call. And so the way we can do that is to add a condition. So we can go ahead and create a condition. It's going to be a branch if else. When we go ahead and include that, we can go ahead and check to see that the status code returned from our API is 200, which means 200 okay, that we've got a valid response. And then we've got a branch here. So if true, what we're going to go ahead and do is set a property. So we can go ahead and do that from manage properties. We're going to set a property. And we're basically going to do a variable assignment here. We're going to call it dialog.weather, and we are going to return the API's response and its content, essentially its message body, to this variable of dialog.api_response. Once we have that set, we can naturally go ahead and use it. And so we're going to return a response back to the chatbot and indicate that the weather is, right back to that message shape, the weather.weather is, and then here's the temperature. This is essentially just a providing a degrees symbol for us. And then we can provide the city that the zip code was provided for. So that's what's going to be returned back into our bot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the user.zipcode property. And the reason why I do this is that if I want to get the weather for another city or another zip code, I want to be able to prompt that. If I don't do that and I type in what is the weather, users.zipcode is already populated, and as a result, it's always going to return Kirkland. So I can go ahead and just delete that property, and it'll then allow me to reprompt. Now, similarly, when we go ahead and we get a failure, so if our response code or status code is not 200, we are going to provide an error back to the bot user. And then what we'll do is we'll delete that user.zipcode just to give the opportunity to provide a new zip code if they want to go ahead and try again. So that essentially is our configuration. When we're done, what we can now go ahead and do is publish to our bot. And this is part of that integration that takes place. So whenever you are making changes and you want to test it, you publish it, it actually gets pushed up to the cloud and gets stored in your bot as content. What is great about this is that when you go ahead and use your ALM and promote your bot from one environment to another environment, this config moves with it, which is great. So back to that comment about not having to manage your runtime is a huge bonus and part of the value of PVA and Bot Framework Composer used together. Okay, so with all of that said, I'm not going to publish because I haven't made any changes, but we can go ahead and now check out our bot. Okay, so I'm going to head over to Power Virtual Agents. I'm going to reset just to get a clean start here. Do note that when we publish our dialog and our trigger, it will show up here inside of PVA. So I can click on this and we're going to see those trigger phrases that I talked about before. Now, what I would suggest here is you don't want to get into a syncing issue. So don't try to go ahead and make modifications here. Then you're going to have to push it down to Bot Framework Composer to make other changes and then publish it back. I would recommend doing everything from one place. In this case, I feel like Bot Framework Composer makes the most sense. Now, if we go ahead and click into the authoring canvas, we can go ahead and see that this has automatically been added for us. Now, because we've got our trigger and we've got our dialog, this is essentially locked for us. I can't go ahead and add anything inside of here, but this is partly because we've got trigger phrases. You do have that ability to just have dialogues that would be available. That would allow you to call it from another topic. So much more sort of information to share when it comes to Composer and PVA. So let's just go ahead and get back into our test harness, and we're going to go ahead and just prompt for weather. So at this point, our Bot Framework Composer configuration has been launched. We are now into that dialog and that trigger, and we've got the welcome to the weather bot. Where do you want the weather for? So let's start with an error, right? We're just going to put gibberish in here, and it's going to come back and say, sorry, that's not valid. And so what's awesome here though is like I haven't had to like build a now new logic to compensate for this. Just to keep things simple and nice, I'm going to go ahead and provide a valid zip code. This is the zip code for Kirkland, Washington. And sure enough, now we've got our response back. We can see that the weather is rain, which we saw over here. The weather is rain, the city is Kirkland, and the temp is 36. So we've included all of that information as part of our response back to the bot. Now let's say someone gets in a tough spot and they are just continue to put in bad data. So 1 bad input, 2 bad inputs, and then 3 bad inputs, right? This is where we're going to use that default value and saying I'm going to pass in the weather for Kirkland, Washington, and here we go ahead and can provide that. So we essentially get the user out of that loop, and that's something that we can go ahead and naturally control. So that concludes today's demo. I hope you see the value in using Bot Framework Composer and PVA together. I think this is a great use case to, sometimes it is challenging to do all of that validation in Power Automate. So I think this is a great tool that keeps things pretty lean. Naturally, there are some additional skills. I'm still learning Bot Framework Composer myself in order to truly take advantage of it, but it becomes part of an extensibility story. You know, my recommendation is always start with low code and move to code. And so it's one of those things where if you can do something easily in Power Automate, do it. But if you get into a situation where it's a little bit more complicated or cumbersome, then look to Bot Framework Composer. Perhaps you can do something like I've just done here, which is pretty reasonable in my mind, in order to get you that functionality. And then if that doesn't work, then you can go ahead and go to a full code solution and build your bot framework skill if necessary. So that concludes today's demo, and thanks for checking it out. All right, so that concludes another episode on the channel. Thanks for checking it out. Really appreciate it. If you're not following me on Twitter, I'd encourage you to go ahead and do so at Weare. Obviously, you're on YouTube, so I appreciate you checking out the video, but likes and subscribes are always nice. I do post at least weekly, and I'm focused on the Power platform. Thanks again for taking time to watch this video, and we'll catch you soon. Later.